Welcome to Data Skeptic K-Means Clustering, the podcast exploring the problem, the algorithms, enhancements, and use cases for K-Means clustering. The results of solving a K-means problem is a set of boundaries that define which cluster to associate any new data points with as they arrive. In 2 dimensions, those boundaries plot very nicely, and the picture tells the whole story, maybe even in 3 dimensions. But in higher dimensions than that, where your data has many more features, there's no guarantee the resulting classification will be intuitive or easy to explain in common parlance. Why did you get these particular clustering results? In this episode, I speak with Lucas Murtinho about his work on Explainable K-Means.
My name is Lucas Murtinho. I'm a Brazilian data scientist. I'm a PhD student at PUC-Rio in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. And I'm a data scientist at Migos, a Brazilian startup.
What's the focus of your PhD?
So I'm studying explainable K-means clustering, which is basically a subset of explainable artificial intelligence, where we try to figure out what's going on in machine learning models that are not necessarily very easy for us humans to understand.
So the paper we're going to discuss is then right at the heart of your PhD work. I'm curious, how did you get into that focus? First, explainability, which is an up-and-coming topic, and then K-means specifically.
Well, actually, my advisor and I, we were attracted to this topic by the original paper from Dasgupta in, I believe it was 2020, Explainable K-Means Clustering, where the authors introduced this idea of sort of not replacing, but trying to explain a partition of data with a simpler, not necessarily simpler, but a more explainable model. So the main idea is to use a decision tree to replace the original model. And we felt that there was an avenue for research there. And just in general, we think that explainability, it is a hot topic for a good reason, right? Because we feel that it's important for us to understand what's going on for several reasons, for ethical reasons, for technical reasons, to really know if your algorithm is doing what you think it's doing, or if it's learning from data that shouldn't be there, or if it's somehow getting a peek in stuff that you're not allowed to peek at. So we feel that explainability is a crucial topic for machine learning, for it to be more accessible, more reliable. And we are working at a very specific point, but hopefully this can help us along the way to a better understanding of machine learning models in general.
Well, most of the work I'm familiar with in explainability for ML focuses on supervised learning. Is this, to the best of your knowledge, the first really foray into an unsupervised explainability?
Yes, as far as we know, for unsupervised learning, this is very new, right? And after the paper, the Dasgupta paper, Dasgupta and his co-authors, and our paper, several other papers. Well, I should say this is our second paper on the subject. We wrote one that was published in ICML last year, I believe. And I think there were 2 other papers in the same conference. And ever since, I think there were at least half a dozen papers on kind of the same subject. So it's a very hot topic right now.
So I'm imagining myself in maybe an executive role where I don't have the technical background to fully appreciate what K-means is, but my data scientists have brought me this result, and I want to know, is it useful? Should I deploy it in some way? How can your work help me as that, somewhat technical, but not a programmer, not a data scientist, help that person get a better understanding of what the clustering approach is doing?
Okay, so the main idea of these algorithms is we're going to replace whatever weird borders the K-means clustering algorithm came up with. We are going to replace it with borders that come from a decision tree, a binary decision tree. So basically, we are asking yes or no questions to the data, right? So the idea is that, let's say that you have 5 variables and somehow you came up with 10 clusters. And what we are trying to do is to replicate these 10 clusters as best as we can by asking each variable a yes or no question. So we could ask, is variable 1 larger than 10? So it's a yes or no question. If it's yes, we move along a certain path in the tree. If it's no, we move along another path in the tree. And with these questions, we are able to explain the cluster, right? That's the main idea, that even someone who's not familiar with machine learning, these boundaries, these clusters, they can be hard to visualize as the dimensions grow. So if we do this sort of list of yes or no questions, it may be easier for people to understand what's going on and even to figure out, okay, so now I understand what this cluster is about, right? What kind of data is in this cluster? So that's the main idea of these kinds of explainable algorithms that rely on decision trees.
Well, decision tree has that appeal for all the same reasons we see it elsewhere in explainability, but thinking to that hypothetical executive I mentioned, if you bring me a tree that takes 20 pieces of paper to, glued together to visualize because it's so deep and so wide, I'm probably not going to be super satisfied. What else can we constrain here?
Well, yes, and that's precisely the topic of our newest paper, right? So the idea is that for a specific cluster, you don't want to ask too many questions to the data, basically, right? So if I need to ask, as you mentioned, if I need to ask 20, 30 questions to understand that cluster, to define that cluster, then maybe it's not as explainable as I thought it would be, right? So our goal is to have shallow decision trees in the sense that, so maybe it can be a wide tree, right? If we have too many clusters, that may be inevitable. But for any specific cluster, we are not going to ask a lot of questions, right? Hopefully we can get away with 5, 6 questions to figure out each single cluster, what it is about.
And what sort of trade-off do you have to work with to have a shallower tree?
Well, we do know that in some cases, in the very first paper about explainable clustering using decision tree, the authors present a very simple counterexample, very simple example, I should say, to show that in some cases you need a tree as deep as you can go, basically, to have the best possible explainable partition. So in the sense that when we talk about the quality of this partition, we are comparing it to an original unexplained algorithm, right? So what happens is we have an unexplained, well, not necessarily unexplainable, but it's not bound to be explainable. So we have the original K-means algorithm. It comes up with a partition, and we try to replicate this partition using yes or no questions that we ask the data.
And I guess this is kind of an aside, but I'm curious, is there any concern there that the clustering algorithm could produce some partitioning that the decision tree couldn't express in some way? Is that mathematically possible?
Yes, if you limit the depth of the decision tree, that is absolutely possible. If you don't, and in fact you have another paper, I believe it's called XKMC for, I think it's explainable K-means clustering, but in that paper they don't limit. What happens basically in our papers when we talk about the decision tree, each leaf of the tree is a cluster, right? So if I have 10 clusters, I necessarily have 10 leaves. And there's this one paper where this is not true. You can have 20 leaves, and maybe 2 of them represent a cluster, and 3 of them represent another one. So you don't have any limit on how deep the tree can be, so you can ask as many questions as you want. If that's the case, you can replicate whichever algorithm you have, whichever partition you have. But the trade-off here is that you're going to ask so many questions that in the end, it's not going to be explainable, right? So in practice, if we want to explain, we need to limit the number of questions. And the first limitation that people thought about was, okay, so let's have 1 leaf per cluster. And now what we are doing with this new paper is we are asking, okay, is that enough? And can we do better without losing a lot in terms of partition quality?
Well, having a shorter tree depth it's intuitively appealing to me, right? Shorter explanation is, if it fully describes things, I definitely want a shorter description. I know in decision trees you can put a hard limit on it and say, maximum depth of X, but it seems like you're looking to control it or regularize in a more sophisticated way. Could we talk a little bit about the algorithmic contributions?
Yes, actually, we try to come up with a penalty, basically, right? So it's like if you have many algorithms that do that try to control maybe the size of given parameters by penalizing high values, right? So that's what we do here, basically. But the technical difficulty is that it's a greedy algorithm, right? So we are always trying to find the best next cut. And the hard part was figuring out, okay, if I'm at the very beginning of the tree, so I have no partition, right? I have not partitioned my data. Maybe there's a cut here. When I do my first cut, how can I analyze, well, the quality of the cut I can do by figuring out how many points get separated from their original centroids, right? That's the basic idea. But to figure out how bad this cut is in terms of making my tree deeper, there's not necessarily an obvious answer there. And what we came up with was okay, if we keep doing cuts that create this unbalance in the data, right? That keeps, I don't know, let's say that the first cut separates 90% of my data to one side and 10% to the other. So if we have a cut that is unbalanced, and if we keep having unbalanced cuts, then we're going to end up with a deep tree. So we don't want cuts that separate the data in an unbalanced way. When I say we don't want, we penalize cuts that separate data in an unbalanced way, right? So in one of the data sets in which we test our algorithm, this came up because if we don't worry about depth, then what happens is that the tree ends up basically it ends up being as deep as it can. And if we do care about depth, and if we introduce a small penalty, I believe it was 3%, then it comes up with trees that are much shallower on average. So this penalty can actually, in experiments, we show that they can help with shallower trees without losing a lot of quality.
Thanks to our sponsor, ClearML. ClearML is an open-source MLOps solution users love to customize. It helps you easily track, orchestrate, and automate ML workflows at scale. Machine learning is no fad. Your organization is only going deeper on investment. Don't let this be a source of technical debt. ClearML can improve every step in your ML workflow, making it a tool loved by data engineers, ML engineers, DevOps people, and data scientists alike. ClearML is hands down the best collaborative ML tool with full visibility and extensibility. As a contributor on a machine learning team, ClearML amplifies your efforts. As a manager, ClearML gives you the transparency and metrics to guide your team's efforts effectively when you can't get pulled into the weeds. Their solution logs your entire process. Your data and models are versioned, so there's no questions of provenance or audits that can't be done. Model repositories give you a clear view of available binaries, and you can deploy pipelines directly from code. Supercharge your entire development process. Go check out ClearML today. Visit clear.ml to get started.
I'm Jeff Wheelwright, tech journalist and host of the ARM Viewpoints podcast. Along with ARM, the company whose technology sparked the mobile revolution, we're bringing you the latest from the heart of the tech world. I've had fascinating conversations with industry experts about topics ranging from AI and data security to the promise of 5G and the future of healthcare, and we're just getting started. Join us as we explore the evolving world of computing. Download and subscribe to ARM Viewpoints at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts.
The experiments, I think, are a critical part of the work, because there's any number of data sets, and of course we're going to bump into something like the no free lunch theorem here. So it's really good to have this anchored into some real-world use cases. Could you share details about the experiments you ran?
We ran experiments in 16 different data sets, and they range from small, very simple data sets like the Iris toy data set, which we are basically using just to make sure that our algorithm is not doing anything crazy. We also use some other classical data sets like many news groups. Just classical algorithms that people use for analyzing partitions and classification models. And in my mind, the most interesting ones are those where our competitors, if I can put it this way, different explainable algorithms, they come up with trees that can be good in terms of quality. They can come up with good clusters, but at a very high cost in terms of the questions that you ask, right? And in fact, another thing that was interesting when we analyzed the experiments is that by simply asking this question, by introducing this penalty factor and asking this question about the depth of the tree, this trade-off, it was not evident, basically. So now we can think about, do I want something more explainable or do I want a better partition, right? This trade-off, it was not clear in the context of the discussion regarding explainable K-means. And I think that may be, in fact, our greatest contribution, not necessarily the algorithm by itself, but just the idea that even if you have a decision tree, which is sort of explainable in theory, you need to, in practice, you need to think about that executive you're talking about. How can I make it explainable for this person? How can I actually explain this cluster?
And how would a data scientist or machine learning practitioner use that as a parameter in practice?
Well, we do have a recommendation of using a penalty of a small penalty. Obviously, that depends on the problem, and it can be like a hard limit on the number of questions you can ask to figure out a cluster. But our recommendation is to add a small penalty, because if you add too large of a penalty, we did run some experiments trying to use larger factors for the penalty, but you end up with partitions that are very far away from, well, not necessarily, but you can end up with partitions that are very far away from the original ones that the original K-means clustering, the original algorithm came up with. So it's sort of a subjective decision, but we feel that sacrificing a lot in terms of partition quality does not make sense because the clusters become meaningless. So our advice would be start small and try to figure out maybe the smallest penalty factor that makes sense.
Well, you've got a variety of data sets you described and a couple of competitor algorithms that could be analyzed. What's the key metric or a couple of key metrics you want to look at when comparing the results?
Well, in terms of quality of the partition, what we do is something that was called in the very first paper on explainable K-means clustering, it was called the price of explainability. Well, we are using the traditional K-means loss function, and we want to know by how much the loss function of the explainable partition differs from the loss of the unexplainable partition, right? So basically what we're saying is, okay, by using an explainable partition, you have a 10% increase in cost when compared to the unexplainable partition. So that's in terms of the quality of the partition. In terms of explainability itself, how explainable this result is, we basically have, well, we need to look at the depth of the tree. So what we can do is we can look at the maximum depth of the tree, and we actually started out with that, but that's not necessarily very informative because maybe you have a cluster at the very end of the tree that has very few data points in it. So you may not worry that much about this one weird cluster because you can explain most clusters with very few questions. So we started to think about it in terms of weighted depth, right? So if we have one cluster that can be explained with a single cut and it has a lot of data points, that's good for us, right? Because with one question, you already figure out to which cluster a bunch of your points belong. We basically weight the depth of the tree by the number of points that can be explained at each level. And the second important metric that we used was the weighted explanation size. So that can be different from the depth of the tree because the tree, it's going to describe the whole partition. But if I want to describe a single cluster, maybe I'm asking repetitive questions along the way. So maybe I'm asking, is A larger than 10? And if it is, then I'm going to ask again, is A larger than 20? So for the cluster that goes along that path, one of these questions is redundant, right? I don't need to ask, is A larger than 10 if I'm going to be asking, is A larger than 20? So if I think about specific clusters, I can think about, okay, how many questions do I need to ask my data to define this cluster? So there's two different metrics, the weighted depth of the tree and the weighted explanation size. So how many questions I need to ask to define each cluster, and that gets weighted by the number of data points in each cluster.
And through those lenses, those two metrics, how does your algorithm fare and how does it compare to the results for others?
Well, basically, it was interesting because we compared it against 3 algorithms. Well, I should say 4, but for one of them, it was clear that our algorithm was better. But for 3 of them, one of them being our own algorithm from last year. And what happened was, against 2 of these algorithms, we compare with them, we are competitive with them in terms of the quality of the partition, meaning that we are usually in the same neighborhood in terms of the actual cost of the partition we are creating, but we are significantly better in terms of the depth of the tree. So for this other algorithm, we were better in terms of cost and competitive in terms of depth. So it goes back to what I was saying, that because we have this factor, we can actually sort of choose if we want to be more explainable or if we want to have a lower cost. So that's a possibility that we have in our algorithm that was not there previously. But generally, we were satisfied with the results in terms of always being competitive against other algorithms, at least one dimension, and being better in the other.
And is it a computational cost that we're talking about or something else?
In terms of computational cost, our algorithm can be a little bit slower, but not by a lot. And actually, for all of these algorithms, in fact, you need to start from an unexplainable partition, which, usually you're going to come up with by running K-means. And that cost, the cost of running K-means, once it's factored in, it doesn't really matter what kind of explainable algorithm you're using afterwards, right? Because in most cases, the cost of the unexplainable algorithm is going to be larger. The cost here is in terms of the partition itself, right? So, basically, we are measuring the distance between each point and the centroid of the cluster, and we are comparing this cost against the cost of the unexplainable partition. So in terms of this cost, I can, comparing with the other algorithms that give us explainable partitions, we can either give competitive partitions in terms of cost, in terms of the loss function, which are more explainable, or we can give partitions that are as explainable as the partitions from the other algorithms and have a smaller value in terms of loss function.
Well, I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of adoption. Is this a technique that users of K-means clustering should rapidly adopt?
I think it sort of depends on how important explainability is to you, because actually, you're going to start out from an unexplainable partition. So you already have a partition that in terms of loss function, it's going to be better than our results, because our results will go from that and we can replicate that result if we're lucky. If we're not, it's going to be a little bit worse. And it may be a lot worse, actually. It sort of depends on how you implement it in terms of the factor, the penalty factor for deeper trees. So the basic idea is that if you don't care about explainability, then there's no reason really to use it. On the other hand, if you do care about explainability, then it's a good idea to check it out, because it can give very good results in terms of you losing very little in terms of the loss function. So you have a partition that is almost as good as the one you had before, but you have the advantage that you can explain it, right, with a few questions that you ask your data.
Well, at the top, you'd mentioned this is the focus of your PhD, so I'm sure you have more ideas than fit into this 20-page paper. What other aspects of this are you exploring?
Well, one of the things we were discussing is that sometimes, for these data sets, the K was sort of obvious, right? The number of clusters that you needed. And sometimes this is not obvious, right? So we are actually searching for how many clusters should I have? And one idea we are exploring is, okay, if we don't know the number of clusters, how can we apply explainable clustering to try and find maybe, to explain how we found the number of clusters, or maybe to have, okay, this is the best possible, or at least an approximation of the best possible explainable 2 means clustering, 3 means clustering, 4 means clustering, then you can choose, right? So that's one idea. The other idea is that trying to figure out what makes a partition harder to explain or not, because in some data sets, we incur a small loss by switching to an explainable partition, while in other ones, this loss can be more significant, right? Even if the penalty factor is small. So we would like to look at, maybe try to find some heuristics to actually figure out, maybe even before applying an explainable algorithm, will I lose a lot in terms of partition quality if I do this. So these are a couple of ideas that we are trying to tackle right now.
Very interesting. Is there anywhere people can follow your research online?
I have a Twitter account, but I don't use it to discuss technical things. I just do silly stuff there, basically, and very rarely. But we do have, it's in Portuguese, but we do have an Instagram account. I think it's at DI PUC-Rio, so DIPUCRIO. So that's the computer science department of my university.
We'll have links to the show notes so people can follow up. Lucas, thank you so much for coming on Data Skeptic.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
That concludes another installment of Data Skeptic K-Means. Thanks to our sponsors, ClearML and ARM Viewpoints Podcast. Myself, Claudia Armbruster, as associate producer, Vanessa Bly, guest coordinator, show notes written by David Abembe, and our host, Kyle Polich.